Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today's podcast, I'm going to talk about the Masonic Freemason plot to destroy feminine modesty and to destroy virtue. And it's been going on a long time. I'm going to talk about modesty in dress. I'm going to talk about temptation. I'm going to talk about the reality of how men and women should be dressing, especially as these summer months are upon us. And I'm going to read a lot of quotations and things like that from popes. And we're also going to talk about how Our Lady of Fatima warned about this and how this really is the devil's plot to destroy civilization. And the popes have been warning about this for a long time. Before I continue, if you are seeing this on YouTube in the public sense, the video will end just when it's getting good. And if you want to see the rest of it, you're going to have to become a YouTube member or you're going to have to sign up for the Substack. Both of those options are in the description area for this podcast. Look down underneath. Or if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify, you will be listening to a free version, or you'll have to pay behind the paywall to listen to the rest. So thank you for your support, and I will talk to you soon. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk about modesty in dress as it pertains to the summer months that are now upon us. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, it might be the winter, but for many places in the Southern Hemisphere, like much of Australia or parts of South America, it's really warm all the time, so this is probably a perennial issue. So years ago, when I was a teacher, I was talking to an administrator, and this administrator was complaining to me, and she was a good woman, but she was complaining to me, we were in a private setting, about the problem with the immodesty of the way that the girls in the school were dressing. Now, there were many problems with male modesty, which usually have to do more with decorum than they do with inciting temptation, just based on the differences in the sexes. But we're going to focus on for this moment on the female aspect, and we will talk about the male aspect before we end the show, because I'm not just going to throw rocks at the ladies here and not, have any accountability for the men. Just please bear with me if that's something you're annoyed with, because I promise I'll address it. But in any event, she was talking about how she wanted to see more modesty in dress with the young ladies, and I thought, well, that's a great idea. And we did have a uniform, but whatever, that wasn't enforced very well, and it was a great conversation. But then she said something that completely threw kind of everything that she said out the window. And she said, but at the same time, a woman should be able to walk down the street in a bikini and be perfectly fine. And I thought to myself, you're kind of undercutting your argument here. I'm with you that there should be modesty in the school and in all settings. But this idea that at the same time, there's no excuse at the same time, it should be perfectly fine that a woman should dress in any way in any occasion, and there should be no problem with that. That really is a misunderstanding of human nature. You see, human beings are fallen. We are wounded by original sin. Even if we're baptized, we still struggle with the concupiscence of the flesh, and this is something that we will struggle with to the day we die. St. Alphonsus Liguori, arguably the greatest modern theologian in the last at least 500 years of the church, if not the church of all time. And in many of his writings, he talks about how even into his late ages, and we're talking about a man who was, as saint as a saint can get. And he talks about even a man like him who is trained in virtue and is extremely holy, even in the priesthood for an older man, there's still going to be the struggle with and against temptation of these sorts of temptations against purity. It's part of the concupiscence of the flesh. It's the same reason, no matter how good you are at eating properly, no matter how good you are at watching what you eat, you're never going to get to the point, really, where you can walk by, a burger on a flat top, frying with cheese and onions and bacon on top, not smell that thing and go, oh man, I wish I could eat that. I mean, that's because you're a human being. Okay. And we know that this is the case because when the holiest of sisters and monks and brothers and priests and monastics and things like that, even in non-Christian religions like Buddhist monks and things, what do? They remove themselves from the world of worldly temptations of all sorts so that they can focus on holiness. And we all recognize the fact that the holiest people are those who are most removed. It doesn't mean because they're removed they're holy, but they achieve a greater level of holiness when they remove themselves from the temptations of the world. And of course, not everyone is called to that. If you're not called to a vocation, if that's not something that you pursue in life, then you're going to live as a person who works in an office or and you have kids, or you work in a school, or you're a lawyer or whatever. You're going to be out in the world doing things, and you obviously can't control other people's behavior. So you need to work on your virtue in order to do that. And this is why the Catholic Church has always insisted on fasting, because fasting is a very interesting thing because everyone has to eat. You can fast for a long time. I think Kevin James, he recently said that he fasted for 41 days or something, which is true. I think he had a lot of weight he could lose while fasting, but nonetheless, you can do that. People say it would be impossible for Christ to fast for 40 days. No, there are people who are not Christ who fast for 40 days right now. This isn't to diminish Christ's fasting, but it's to say that it's possible. And in any event, the reason why we fast is because we have to eat. We want to eat. Eating is both necessary and a pleasure. It's one of the only things where we must do it to survive, and it's also pleasurable to do so. And there's nothing wrong with it being pleasurable or seeking the pleasure in it, because we have to eat. So when we choose to fast, we do something that we know will make us weaker, and we know will bring us pleasure if we were to do it. So it's the most effective way of building up our virtue. It's the most effective way of taming our appetites. Appetites is a word that we associate only with food, but appetites have to do with everything from sexuality to the music choices we like, to basically all types of emotional interactions and pleasures that we would like to have in this life. Those are all part of our appetites. And so fasting is something that sort of kills that temptation and gives us the strength to avoid temptation when it presents itself. So of course we have to do that. There's no excuse for falling into temptation, in the sense that it's not like you're not culpable because you did. And you'll notice this as you grow in virtue, hopefully as you age, certain things that would be difficult for you to be around when you're a 14-year-old kid filled with hormones. If you attend the sacraments and you are built in virtue and you fast and you practice the mortifications of a good Christian life, by the time you're a grown-up, you'll be in a position where you can withstand certain temptations, and that's a good thing. But no one alive can say to themselves, it will be impossible for me to fall into temptation. No one alive can say that, whether it's a temptation against purity, whether it's a temptation towards drinking too much, whether it's a temptation towards gambling. I know there's certain gambling that's not sinful. Obviously, you can just play a friendly game of cards. I'm not talking about recreational sorts of things, but the sinful way of doing it, a temptation towards impurity in speech. People get great pleasure out of gossiping, even though they know it's wrong. My wife and I were watching something the other day, and the issue of sort of tabloid journalism came up. And I said to her, I think tabloid journalists, the people who do Us Weekly or People Magazine or whatever you see on the shelves of the grocery store, those people are probably going to be at the lowest level of hell, because it's one of the most vile and vicious ways you could ever make a living. It's sinful. There is no possible way to do tabloid journalism in a way that isn't sinful. It's all sinful. It's ridiculous. And it's an economy of sin, because people are obsessed with the sins of others, and they get a pleasure out of They take pleasure in knowing the sins of others. It's completely morbid. I mean, gossip magazines and tabloid stuff is one of the most wicked things that's ever befallen the human race. It's a massively disgusting sin. And that's something that's obviously more common to women than it is to men. In any event, as we grow in holiness, hopefully, and in virtue, we will be able to withstand certain temptations. But everyone who has any awareness of themselves, anyone who has any awareness of their predilections towards temptation, will know that you must remove those things as much as possible from your environment. Let's use an analogy here. Alcoholics, people who really have a problem with alcohol to the point where it's a dependency and so forth. If they embark on some sort of treatment program, whatever it is, Alcoholics Anonymous or something, or the other ones out there, it's very clear in those programs that you are not to be in any circumstance, at least in the beginning, until you really have a hold on the problem. You are not to be in a circumstance where you will be around the thing that you sin with, whether it's drugs or alcohol. So if you are someone who manages a bar or something like that, and you have a problem with drinking, well, I would imagine if you join Alcoholics Anonymous, your sponsor will probably tell you, you have to get a new job. I use a similar example when I counsel men on their pornography usage. People reach out to me and things like that because of my writings on masculinity and male virtue. And if they tell me that they have a problem that they just can't seem to kick when it comes to that issue of pornographic material, I'll say to them, you have to get rid of your cell phone. You have to get rid of your unnecessary private computer use. And they'll give me all sorts of excuses. And they'll say, well, I need to because I have a job or whatever. Then you have to get another job. And I'm serious. It's as serious as a heart attack. If someone can't use a device, if someone sins by using an instrument, and that instrument is their gateway towards the sin, and whenever they fall, they're using that instrument, then they have to get rid of that instrument. The instrument is not evil. A cell phone is not intrinsically evil. A computer is not intrinsically evil. Many great things can be done with those. I'm using a computer and a cell phone right now, and everything is perfectly licit. But if someone has an issue, they have to get rid of them. No amount of filters will work, etc. But then there comes a point when somebody does get a handle on whatever temptation they have, that they can be in certain circumstances they couldn't be in before. So, for example, the alcoholic who has a major problem and has to dry out and whatever, it could be 6 months, it could be 6 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years, it could be forever in some cases. He can never be in a bar. He can never be in a liquor store. People can never have alcohol in his presence. And if that's the case, then that's the case. But in many cases, they get to the point where they can be around, they can go to a restaurant, order a, soda water with lime, and they're fine because they have a handle on it. But even a person who has a handle on it, he would never tell you that, sure, he doesn't have a problem avoiding alcohol, but he's not going to go and, I don't know, he's not going to go and try to be a beer taster. It's like, don't worry, I'll just spit out the beer after you taste it. No, he's obviously going to fall if he's in that position. So there's still certain scenarios that person can never be in. So what does this have to do with modesty? Well, while it is not the fault of women who dress in the immodest fashions of our age that men are sinful, we can be an accomplice with other people's sin. Someone was telling me about a sermon from one of their priests many years ago at a traditional chapel. And the priest gave this amazing sermon on modesty. And, he sort of ended the sermon saying about how women were supposed to dress when they came to church, especially. And he said, for the sake of your children, for the sake of your husbands, for the sake of your neighbor. And he said, for the love of your priests. And he said it very emphatically, and it was very moving. And a lot of the women said how it just it completely changed the way they looked at modesty, because it was this holy priest, a good man, who was saying, listen, wake up. Everyone is a human being. Even those of us who have great virtue, we are still not out of it's not out of the realm of possibility that they can fall into temptation. And, maybe women might say, well, this isn't fair. Well, life is not fair. There are many things that we don't do around other people because we don't want to tempt them to sin. This is just one of those things. As Catholics, we're not Muslims. We don't believe you should walk around with a garbage bag on and a sack over your head. No one's telling you to do that. But it's just follow certain guidelines of modesty, follow certain norms of modest dress that have been, tried and tested throughout all the ages. And there's nothing wrong with beauty. There's nothing wrong with the feminine physique or anything like that. I mean, these are all beautiful, good things God has created, but there has to be a temperance. There has to be a modesty, a decorum in how these things are presented. And if you are a Catholic woman, especially, that you're a sinner because you're a human being. And while it might seem annoying that certain way of dressing would be required in order to aid your brother Christians in their pursuit of salvation, in their journey on this earth as a pilgrim trying to make it to heaven. Maybe you think that's not fair, but there are plenty of cases where women are exposed or more easily fall into temptation, and men should be aware of that as well. I mentioned the gossip magazine thing. I mean, that is a distinctly, I mean, there are some men that are into it, but really, I bet you 90% of the purchases of gossip magazines and things like that at a grocery store are women. If I was a grocery store owner and I could, I would not have those shelves. I would not put that stuff in there because I know that it's very likely that there are going to be many women who are going to fall into that temptation, as many of them do. I mean, we all have to be thinking about the fact that all of us have a human nature and all of us have a fallen nature. Now, there's also another aspect to this as well. When I was a teacher, I was trying to explain this to my students, and they were pretty receptive to it. In fact, I often found that young women especially, they actually, I mean, most people have good nature, and they really found it refreshing to hear it spoken of this way because they were appreciative of the idea that one could recognize the predilection towards sin that many men fall into, but at the same time, there's this tenderness that women often have and this empathy that they're usually better at than men, and the idea that they could actually help their fellow Christians behave better, so to speak, was something that they usually were pretty receptive of. But I got a few questions, and one of the questions was, I remember the student, I was talking about makeup, and they were asking me, Mr. Hall, is it sinful to wear makeup? And I said, well, I know some people get upset about that. I have not found anything that is binding on Christians through any sort of, de fide proclamation that says, thou shalt not wear makeup. But I said, whatever your opinion may be on makeup, there is clearly a way of doing makeup that is classy and, modest, beautiful, and obviously it's something that is improving the look, which is why people wear it. And there's a way of doing it that is sultry and whatever. And they said, well, Mr. Hall, what if I like to wear the makeup that is sultry and stuff? And I said, well, that's really sad for you because you feel good about yourself when you make yourself look like an object of temptation for other men. So that really is a problem with how you view yourself. And they kind of got it, and they said, oh yeah, it's kind of weird that I want to look like a prostitute. That's not really a good way to want to be. So this also goes to the heart of what is good for women as well. It's not just about, men are these bumbling fools who have no self-control. Men must have self-control. And there's no excuse for sin, even if you're tempted. I mean, you've still made the decision to sin. But, you think of St. Francis of Assisi, for example. He jumps into the bush of thorns, the thorn bush, because he had this temptation, even just a hint of a temptation against purity. He didn't act on it. Temptations themselves are not sins, but he jumped into a bush of thorns as a way of mortifying his flesh. And I think that actually the bush is still there and it's still growing. And it's very interesting. But point being, no one's denying that men have to have some responsibility in this, but who are we kidding? I mean, if we are Christians and we want to help our fellow Christian, then no matter what the predilection towards sin is, you need to help your fellow Christian with that. Men have to help women with the certain things that afflict them the most. Women are not perfect. And women have to help men with the things that afflict them most. And, whatever's under their control, they need to help with that. That's just charity. That's just Christian virtue. I mean, why would anyone not want to do that? Now, to back up what I'm saying, I'm going to read some stuff here that are actual statements from popes over the last century or so, that talk about exactly what I'm saying and how I've tried to give this sort of nice explanation, which I hope is very approachable for people, that perhaps you can share it. But from a specifically Catholic perspective, from a perspective of like what is sinful, and what has always been seen as sinful, I want to show you something here that has certain teachings from popes. So there was a book that came out about 20 years ago at this point, and it's called Dressing with Dignity. It's a pretty famous book. And it's a very traditionally Catholic-minded book. There are other books on modesty, and they come from often sort of the Novus Ordo setting. And I think they kind of missed the mark because, I mean, there's just a lot lacking in understanding of virtue in sort of the conciliar paradigm, if I'm being honest. So this one is pretty good.